May I have a follow-up question? You mentioned a war. Okay. Were we at war with France or was it Britain?
Oh dear, no, much worse.
What could be worse?
With ourselves, over slavery.
Mm-hmm.
For some 30 years prior to my administration, there was a growing movement among the slave-owning states to secure that peculiar institution in perpetuity. And because of the early provisions that had excluded slavery from the territory that you secured, I had always believed that that would not happen. But there were some changes that took place, a war with Mexico, acquisition of new territory, and within 5 years, 3/4 of our national domain had fallen into the hands of the slave-owning interests. And a new party came on the scene to fight that expansion of slavery, and in resistance to that, secession was declared amongst the slave-owning peoples, and it, as near as I could tell, was not legally done without an amendment to the Constitution, and we ended up at war.
Secession?
Yes.
Your own Virginia, gentlemen, was one of the key states to secede, probably the key state.
We thought during the Constitutional Convention that it was just a matter of time that slavery would no longer be part of our economy, part of our country. When we came to the issue of slavery, we knew that we could not get a constitution if we didn't soft pedal the slavery issue, because the South said that they would not be part of a constitution, a federal constitution. So we felt as though it's just a matter of time and it will go out on its own. Oh my gosh.
That's what I thought most of my life.
I can recall, this was after your time, President Washington, during an event in the Congress. They were debating what was called the Missouri Compromise, and a Mr. Talmadge, I believe of New York, submitted an amendment to that particular authorization to bring in Missouri as a state and Maine as a state, that there would be a restriction of slavery based upon a border. And it was at that point that I felt it was a fire bell in the night, that we were merely holding off what you inevitably happened and you described. And we in the South, we had thought that there was going to be a economic reversal of fortune. But then there was a gentleman from New York, I believe, or Connecticut, I believe, Mr. Whitney.
Mm-hmm.
And Mr. Whitney developed something called the cotton gin. And once that took place, the value of the individual slaves began to rise. And then we have a conflict with morality versus avarice. And we held a wolf by the ears, and we did not know how to let it go without harming ourselves. And what you described, Mr. Lincoln,
That compromise was repealed.
nonetheless, the effects of that border was
Yes.
A fire bell in the night, exactly.
Well, the really sad things is it pitted brother against brother.
Oh my, yes.
The families were divided. My own family, my father, the Roosevelts, they were true New York Yankees, and they supported the Republican Party by then, and Mr. Lincoln. Well, my mother's family, the Bullocks, they were Georgians, and they were Georgians to the core.
Wow.
And so when Georgia seceded, or tried to secede, they supported the Georgians, because I had uncles who fought for the southern states. And so the families, it was remarkable that families could stay together at all in such and of course what happened were hundreds of thousands of Americans lost their lives along with their fortunes.
So that sounds like a repeat of the Revolutionary War with patriot versus loyalist. And we witnessed some barbarity between the redcoats, Hessians, and patriots, but in some cases it was not compared to what the patriots did against the loyalists and what the loyalists did against the patriot.
Oh, yes, it's brother to brother. Even in the state of Missouri, the crimes of one neighborhood against another were horrendous. It's just the demons were let loose on the land. And in your own time, wasn't it estimated, what, a third of Americans at that time were loyalists to Great Britain, if I'm not mistaken? Is that?
You know, it depends on who you talk to. The maximum I've heard is a third, and a third in the middle, but then I've heard others that said it was less than 20%, 20% was 60% in the middle. Did you came after me? Was there any clarification during your time about the balance of loyalists, patriots, and neutral?
The figures that you stated were the same that I have heard,
Okay.
but I would take one exception. The struggle that we had divorcing ourselves, separating ourselves from King George III, were based upon a rebellion and a different principle of governance. What has happened that Mr. Lincoln and Mr. Roosevelt described is saying that is it possible that the spirit of 76, which our generation did
Yes.
so much to engender, has that now been removed, and are we now moving back to more of a monarchical system, or have we returned to a republic? I'm not certain what the results of this conflict is. What is that?
That's an excellent question, and it prompts me to ask you something, because what happened, I grew up with this notion that the ideas that were conceived through the Declaration and in your generation would last throughout all time. But what happened was there were folk that began sailing the world, and they discovered races of people, and some of them were in our own nation, the native people that lived here, Indians, and these educated folk had concluded that there are indeed certain inferior species of mankind, and they began to mock the Declaration as something of old, a previous generation that everybody knows was foolishness, and that we are now thoroughly modern and we understand that all men are not created equal. And they mocked and scorned it. And so, for instance, I ended up in a debate before I became president over this very point, and my adversary, who at the time was he was on the Supreme Court of Illinois and so forth, and he became a senator, but he concluded that the framers, which would include you gentlemen both, had never intended to say all men were created equal, to mean that. They only said that. What they really meant was all white men. And I was burdened with the job of trying to figure out, through research and study of older documents in libraries, if indeed that could have been true, that what you really meant was to conceive a nation only for white men, but not for all. And my conclusion was that that was not true, and that was the point of my argument. A good many people began to mock and scorn those older ideas, but I held fast based on my research. So my question is, was I in error, or did you indeed mean all humans when you said all, or did you only mean white people?
All members of the human family are due life, liberty, and the ability to pursue their own happiness. And what you described, I remember my own thoughts, I was asked by a Frenchman, even before, right at the conclusion of our revolution, I was asked by a Frenchman to comment on this issue. I had communication from a gentleman from France, Barbé Marbois, and he had asked me a series of questions, and one of them dealt with the issue of slavery. And my response to it, and I will not quote it exactly, the hebetude of age has obviously affected my abilities, but I do recall saying, can the liberties of this nation be thought secure if we violate their only firm basis in the minds of our people, that our rights are gifts of God to each individual. And if we violate these rights, then what will happen to us? There could be an exchange of circumstances between the white and the black races, the white and the red races. There could be a reversal of fortune, perhaps by supernatural interference. All I can say is the Almighty will take no side with us, sir, in such a contest, and what you have described fulfills my worst fears.
I think one of the things I find it remarkable about the Declaration, and that's what it is. It's a declaration. It's no God-given law or even a law by an elected body of the Republic. It's a declaration, a statement. But what I find interesting was that a gentleman who I consider as much a father of our country, the present company accepted, of course, is John Adams. And you and Mr. Adams did not get along very well at times, but Mr. Adams, and agreed to by Mr. Franklin, felt that the document itself was a remarkable and could not have been done better by any body of men. I certainly agree with that. So what you were able to put together is one of the outstanding documents of the world.
Well, I appreciate your encomium, sir, and I will tell you, however, that while I did write the whole document, it was edited by the Second Continental Congress, and I acknowledge that they too contributed.
Yes.
If I may follow up on your question, Mr. Lincoln, my personal experience and contribution to those early documents, Declaration of Independence, Constitution, and my stand on slavery. I was born into Virginia society on a tobacco plantation. I wanted nothing more than to be a plantation owner, and we raised tobacco. Initially, indentured servants helped, but when the demand from Europe was so great for tobacco, we went and had slavery. It was a continuation of centuries of slavery.
Right.
However, my opinions changed over time, and I think the Revolutionary War was much of a factor as any. It was serving alongside many blacks that were in the trenches with the other soldiers. And of course, Billy Lee, my own manservant, I found to be somebody that I thought was an example of intelligence, of strong perseverance, and so my impressions were elevated by that, as well as many of the slaves on the plantation. When we had indentured servants and artisans come, they learned to be carpenters and blacksmiths and just on and on, very, very skilled. And then the Marquis de Lafayette, I had no son, I had no children, and he was like a son to me, and he would challenge me about slavery, and of course a Frenchman, and he bought a plantation in South America for the express purpose of freeing them and allowing them to run their own plantation, those were inspiring. And so after or toward the end and after the Revolutionary War, I sought to begin to release the slaves, to manumit them. Virginia law at the time posed some amount of problems, not only to me, but many other Virginia slave owners. And some of them were able to free and manumit early on when the law changed, but then the law changed back, and so we have this changing legal system, and especially as the President of the United States, do I violate law when I'm sworn to uphold the law? So it was a difficult situation. Plus the other, when I married Martha, I had about 100 and 110 slaves. She had about 200 slaves, and she brought it to the marriage. And so as my views were changing and I wanted to free my slaves, I couldn't free her slaves. Hers were dower slaves, and she was only holding them in trust for her legacy, her children. So they had intermarried. If I freed some of my slaves and they had married the dower slaves, they had 12 months to leave the state. If they didn't leave the state because of the family connections, they could be recaptured and enslaved again.
Yes.
But if they leave, they're separated.
Right.
But if the dower families pursued them, then that's a violation of law. And so on the one hand, it seems a very simple situation. It was much more complicated. And actually, in my will, I did indicate that upon Martha's death, that my slaves would be freed. And again, at that period of time, it was our combined feeling that this institution would not continue, that things would change. And so, like the Constitution, we put it to later generations, and like my will, I put it to later generations, because that's the best idea we had what the future would be. But I'm hearing for you, good sir, that wasn't the future.
Well, I one time said, the plainest print cannot be read through a golden eagle, meaning a coin.
Oh my.
And at the time of when this war broke out, approximately 3/4 of our national economy was in one way or another related to slavery.
Oh my gosh.
I was from Illinois, and about that same percentage of our banks closed upon my election, because they had loaned money to Southern planters, and because the Southern planters had decided to secede with their state, they were not obligated to repay these loans, so the banks had no capital. Our financial system was in absolute disarray as well, because of another president who had destroyed the National Bank, but that's another question.
No. Well, if I may, the original question that I started out with
Oh, that's right.
is, which I don't mind the avenue we
Yeah.
have gone down. That's
Yes.
perfectly all right, an enjoyable conversation. But my time in the White House was wonderful. I know that Mr. Lincoln might not feel the same way, and I know that you have said that the happiest day of your life was when you left the office. Mr. Jefferson, I think you tolerated politicians for your enjoyment, but we Roosevelts loved being in the White House. Well, my children were most of them were younger, teenagers to like 4 years old. And so, you know, with children, you got to pay attention to them, and they won't let you grow old. Your younger children will come to you and decide they want to do this or want to do that. They want you to be a part of it. You go right along with it. But we enjoyed, well, pillow fights and scary ghost stories, and playing on the White House lawn. We would play football games on the White House lawn, and occasionally other games. I know you had your sons with you, and you had a tragedy with them, but there had to be times when they brought great joy into your life as president. I
Well, we
kind of
played
wondered
ball
about
as
that.
well.
Oh,
Not
yeah.
with my feet. I don't know how that game works, but we played a ball where you strike it with a stick.
Yeah, baseball.
And well, some of them are now calling it baseball,
Well, yeah.
and we called it rounds when I was
Yes,
a boy.
uh-huh.
But nonetheless, we played that game, and playing with my sons was one of my chief enjoyments. And the only way sometimes I could relieve myself of the stress of the preponderance of war and the constant visage of the destruction of our nation, and which looked to me like the only hope the world had at the time for freedom from the slavery that dominated all of the world, political tyranny. And so the thought of losing that in just a moment was unbearable, and so I retreated to my family, sometimes to theater, to joke books, to concerts, anything I could to divert my attention from the weight of responsibility that fell upon my shoulders.
I think that's, well, I think the average American would look at what you did and how you did it, and Mrs. Lincoln too, and would empathize with that. I think that's one of the great reasons that even after this war was over with, those who fought in the name of the South, they tended to come around to what a great man you were. I say that knowing you're kind of humble in that, but I think they saw that you were one of them, and that made a difference to Americans.
Well, that is greatly satisfying, gratifying even, to think that Southerners, one of my great fears after this war concluded was, how will Southern people who have been our brothers and sisters for generations, friends in many ways, be dealt with, and how will they respond? Because there were those that were vindictive, and the period was so full of hatred. And so could we let them up easy, as I used to say, and risk some of the old guard returning and then subjugating the freed people? Or must we, on the other side of this discussion, must we hold Southerners under some sort of military rule interminably and cease to be even a free nation because we could not trust them to do what you said actually happened? So it is gratifying to know that Southerners began to at least respond to what I did in a favorable way.
I think you as a man, they responded to